Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Forbes senior contributor Robert Farrington. Robert, thanks for coming back on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
The Supreme Court this week heard oral arguments over President Biden's sweeping student loan forgiveness program. Can you break down what we need to know?
Yeah, so I think a lot of borrowers were looking at the Supreme Court and are waiting with bated breath on whether that student loan forgiveness is going to happen or not. And earlier this week's oral arguments really highlighted where the Supreme Court stood. A lot of the justices had questions on standing, which is, should these lawsuits even proceed? And some of them were like, well, regardless of standing, should student loan forgiveness happen? I think a lot of borrowers need to realize, though, we still have a couple months to go. So it does take about 60 days or so before the Supreme Court delivers their verdict. And that's when we'll know for sure whether, student loan forgiveness is going to happen or not. So we still have about 2 months of waiting to do.
Definitely a waiting game. I'm sure all borrowers are holding their breath right now, but I want to talk more about standing, like you said. Based on what you've heard in the oral arguments, does it sound like the parties who are suing have standing?
It's very tough to say. So there's two takes that I kind of have on this. The standing arguments that the parties brought are kind of a stretch. It's not clear cut. It's not for sure. However, it's important for people to realize that standing is just a Supreme Court precedent. It's not a law. It's not a rule. And the Supreme Court can kind of say, well, we're not going to care about that in this case, and we're going to rule. So we saw that earlier with some other big landmark decisions. For example, Roe versus Wade, another one where the court kind of took past standing issues, pushed them to the side and said, hey, past precedent issues, pushed them to the side and said, hey, we're going to ignore precedent. We're going to change the rules, and this is what we're going to do. So I do have a hunch that we might see something like that with the Supreme Court. They could say, we're going to ignore some of the past rules around standing. We're going to create some new rules because this has some very major implications. And Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts hinted at that maybe we should reconsider standing for this case and maybe how we think about standing in general.
Why do you think this current makeup of the court appears to care less about standing than maybe Supreme Court justices in the past?
I think it's important to remember in this case per se, it's not necessarily about the student loan forgiveness. I know a lot of borrowers have a personal connection to this, but really this is a kind of separation of powers issue. Does the president have these powers? Does Congress has these powers? What are the powers of the Supreme Court? So I actually really think this is more of a, case surrounding some of the really key tenets of our democracy and what the different parties can do. And yes, I feel like student loan borrowers are kind of stuck in the middle of this and they want to get their student loans forgiven, but there's a lot of bigger questions here that really could impact the future on a lot of different fronts.
What are some of those bigger questions? How will this shape the course of the foreseeable future?
Well, I think the real question is what can be done during emergencies? So, does the president really just have blanket powers to do all kinds of stuff during emergencies, or do we really need to rely on Congress for these? And then there's the question of when does the court step in? So, can the court just, ignore some of these standing issues to step into some of these constitutional issues? And again, I think the student loan borrowers kind of get stuck in the middle with this specific case, which is kind of a bummer, but there are other issues here at play.
I do want to kind of get a temperature check from the hearing. Is there any indication of which way some of the justices are leaning?
It's so hard to tell because one of the biggest things that Supreme Court justices do is they play devil's advocate because they're trying to kind of suss out what the future impact of their decisions could be. And so they'll ask a lot of hypothetical questions. They'll ask things like, what happens if we do this or that, and kind of try to figure out different arguments. I will say that the Solicitor General, the person arguing for the United States, she came with her A game and she really delivered some compelling arguments on behalf of the government, which, really built a strong case for allowing student loan forgiveness to happen.
Let's first talk about those arguments. What were the arguments that the Solicitor General brought on Tuesday's hearing?
She really focused on standing was her biggest center of attention. But then, she also kind of asked, were the plaintiffs even, harmed in general? And would student loan forgiveness actually put them in a better situation? So she was even countering that, saying like, they will actually be in a better position if you allow this to go through. But she really brought and answered a lot of questions. There's a lot of technicalities in her argument. But the root cause was the text says that the president can do this. This is why we could do this. And, the standing issues probably, should have the case dismissed as a result.
The Supreme Court currently has a conservative majority. So what issues specifically are conservative justices taking up?
I think some of their biggest concerns that they highlighted were the spending, the presidential power. Does the president have the power to, forgive student loans, not just avoid the hardship? So some of the lines of questioning were, the payment and interest waiver, is what actually stopped people from being harmed during the pandemic. They didn't have to make payments. They didn't have to pay interest on their student loans. But does something like forgiving student loans take that just a little bit farther than avoiding harm? Now you're not only making sure that borrowers aren't being harmed, but you're putting them in a potentially better situation than they were in March of 2020. And so a lot of their questions surrounded this were, a lot of fairness, a lot of potential around, what the implications of forgiving loans versus pausing loans would be, and things along those lines. And so I think their concerns were really around the authority of the president, executive power in general, and, who really controls the purse strings? Is it Congress? Is it the president? And if Congress really meant for this to happen, would they have clearly spelled it out?
I know we do have at least 2 months to wait. It's a bit of a waiting game to see the resolution here. But what is the likelihood of the Biden administration being victorious in one or two of these cases?
I think after the oral arguments the other day, I do think that they have a much better shot than they did going into those oral arguments. I do think that there's also two things that borrowers need to keep into consideration. Is one, that the Biden administration still has until May to potentially extend the student loan pause one more time, because they are relying on that same HEROES Act and the state of emergency to do it. So there is a chance that, maybe that we see another extension before that ends. I think on the second front, though, is that borrowers need to remember two things. Is that student loan payments are going to be restarting 60 days after this decision, whether or not they win or lose. So borrowers might see some loan forgiveness, but a lot of borrowers, if there's no more extensions, might have to plan on resuming their payments, regardless of what the Supreme Court says.
Let's say the Supreme Court does in fact strike down President Biden's student loan forgiveness program here. What should borrowers do?
Right now, they need to be taking steps to get organized with their student loans. So there has been a lot of changes, loan servicer changes, loans moving, new programs starting, potentially a new student loan repayment plan. So I really recommend that borrowers spend an hour in the next month or two, find their loans, get organized with their loan servicer, understand what their repayment plan options could be, and really have a plan in place for when payments restart. Maybe, they get some loan forgiveness and, their loan balance will be smaller. But, either way, loan repayments are looking like they're going to start sometime in the near future.
This was a big win for Democrats when President Biden announced his plan. Does he have a backup plan in case this gets struck down?
That's really tough. So with the state of emergency expiring here come May, it really eliminates a lot of his options to enact student loan relief. So there is the potential that he could extend the student loan pause one last time, maybe potentially even longer. Otherwise, he's really going to be stuck to the existing rules and laws that are in place. So we might see some things like repayment plan changes, some flexibility with public service loan forgiveness or other programs, but something like a blanket loan forgiveness option will probably be off the table, if they lose in the Supreme Court.
Robert, as we get more updates on this, I hope you come back, join us, and break them down. Robert Farrington, thank you so much.
Thank you.